The sun was setting over the city skyline as Ms. Thompson finished gathering her files from her office desk. As one of the most respected federal prosecutors in the district, she had just wrapped up another demanding day in court. The case files sprawled across her desk told the story of months of preparation, white-collar crime investigations that would make headlines once they reached trial. She glanced at her watch and sighed. 7:30 p.m. Another late evening at the courthouse. The cleaning staff had already started their rounds, and the usual bustling hallways had fallen quiet. She could hear the gentle hum of vacuum cleaners in the distance as she packed her briefcase. The drive home should have been routine. The same route she'd taken for the past decade. Her mind wandered to the upcoming weekend plans with her daughter, who was graduating from law school next month. Following in her mother's footsteps, she thought with a smile. The heavy traffic on Martin Luther King Boulevard moved at a crawl, brake lights stretching ahead like a river of red stars. Construction had changed the familiar landscape of her daily commute. New signs had sprouted up over the past week, part of the city's ongoing road improvement project. Lost in thought about tomorrow's court preparations, she didn't notice the recently installed stop sign until she was already halfway through the intersection. The flash of blue and red lights in her rearview mirror snapped her back to reality. Her heart sank, not out of fear, but from the sheer inconvenience of it all. She had testified before the Supreme Court, handled multi-million-dollar federal cases, and helped shape legal precedents. Yet here she was, being pulled over like a teenager who had just gotten their license. She did what any law-abiding citizen would do. Turned on her interior lights, kept her hands visible on the steering wheel, and reached for her documents only when asked. The credentials in her wallet included not just her driver's license, but also her federal prosecutor's badge, a symbol of her dedication to justice and the law. The approaching footsteps were heavy, deliberate. Through her side mirror, she could see the officer's hand resting near his holster, a detail that didn't escape her trained eye. After all, she had worked with law enforcement officers throughout her career. But something felt different about this encounter. License and registration, came the gruff request, flashlight beam sweeping across her face and the car's interior. The leather briefcase on her passenger seat still bore the Department of Justice seal, and case files peeked out from manila folders. But the officer's attention seemed focused elsewhere. She handed over her documents with the practiced calm of someone who had spent their life in courtrooms. "Officer, I'm a federal prosecutor. I work in the courthouse downtown," she explained, her voice steady and professional. The words seemed to bounce off him like rain off a windshield. The next few minutes played out like a scene from a different era. Despite her credentials, despite her professional demeanor, despite the federal prosecutor's badge clearly visible in her wallet, the officer's attitude remained unchanged. He returned to his patrol car, leaving her to wait in growing darkness. When he returned, the citation in his hand told its own story. Not just a ticket for missing the stop sign, but additional violations including failure to cooperate. A charge that seemed to exist only in the officer's imagination. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, someone who had dedicated her life to upholding the law, being handed a citation that reeked of prejudice. "Sign here," the officer demanded, thrusting the citation through her window. Court dates in 2 weeks. No explanation of the charges, no opportunity to discuss the situation, just a stern command and the unspoken expectation of compliance. As she watched the patrol car pull away, she didn't feel anger. Instead, a familiar determination settled over her, the same feeling she got before taking on a challenging case. This wasn't just about a traffic ticket anymore. This was about something much bigger, and she knew exactly what she needed to do next. She carefully placed the citation in her briefcase, right next to the files of her current cases. In 2 weeks, she would appear in traffic court. But unlike most people who would walk through those doors, she knew exactly how the system worked, and more importantly, how it should work. The next chapter of this story would unfold in a courtroom, and she was more than prepared for what would come next. The next morning, Ms. Thompson sat at her kitchen table, coffee growing cold beside her as she examined the citation in detail. Morning sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the paper that had disrupted her otherwise ordinary evening. 20 years of legal experience had taught her to pay attention to details, and this citation was full of them, none of them encouraging. She reached for her phone and did what any experienced prosecutor would do. She started documenting everything while the memories were still fresh. The officer's approach to her car, his dismissive attitude, the way he'd barely glanced at her credentials, it all painted a picture that was unfortunately familiar to her, both personally and professionally. The failure to cooperate charge particularly caught her attention. In her years of prosecuting cases, she'd seen this tactic before, adding extra charges to simple violations, often targeting specific demographics. She pulled out her laptop and began researching recent traffic stop patterns in the area. The data told the story that made her stomach turn. Her daughter called during her research, excited about an upcoming moot court competition. "Mom, you won't believe the case we're arguing." Her daughter bubbled with enthusiasm. Ms. Thompson smiled, remembering her own law school days, but her mind kept drifting back to the citation. Should she tell her daughter about what happened? Would it discourage her from pursuing her dreams in law? After a moment's hesitation, she decided to share the story. "Baby, something happened last night that you need to hear about," she began, her voice steady. As she recounted the events, her daughter's initial shock turned to determination. "Mom, you have to fight this. Think about all the people who go through this without having your knowledge of the law." Those words struck home. She thought about the countless individuals who faced similar situations without the benefit of legal training, without understanding their rights, without knowing how to navigate the system. People who might take plea deals or pay inflated fines simply because they felt they had no choice. Later that day at the federal courthouse, she quietly asked her colleagues about their experiences with local law enforcement and the traffic court system. The stories came pouring out, similar encounters, similar attitudes, similar disparities in treatment. One colleague even pulled up statistics showing a disturbing pattern of elevated fines and additional charges in certain neighborhoods. During her lunch break, she walked down to the court clerk's office to file some paperwork for an upcoming federal case. The clerk, who had known her for years, noticed something was off. "Rough morning?" she asked, sorting through the stack of documents. Ms. Thompson hesitated before sharing her story. The clerk's eyes widened as she described the traffic stop. "You know," the clerk said, lowering her voice, "I've been hearing similar stories from other people. Just last week, a young medical resident came in, practically in tears over a similar situation." Back in her office, she spread out the citation alongside her notes from the morning's research. The more she dug, the more certain she became that this wasn't just about a missed stop sign. This was about a systemic issue that needed addressing. But first, she had to handle her own case. She began preparing for the traffic court appearance with the same thoroughness she applied to her federal cases. She pulled records of similar citations, documented the recent construction changes in the area, and prepared a detailed timeline of the encounter. Her federal prosecutor's badge sat on her desk as she worked, a reminder of both her responsibility and her capability to effect change. The 2 weeks until her court date would give her time to build not just a defense, but a case for examination of the entire system. She thought about the young resident the clerk had mentioned, about her daughter's future in law, about all the people who faced similar situations without her resources or knowledge. As she packed up her office that evening, she made sure to leave early enough to avoid traffic. The same route home felt different now. Each stop sign, each police car, each interaction carried new weight. But rather than feeling discouraged, she felt purposeful. Sometimes the most important cases weren't the ones that made headlines, but the ones that exposed the quiet injustices that happened every day. Tomorrow would bring new federal cases to prosecute, new challenges to face. But for now, she had 2 weeks to prepare for a traffic court appearance that she intended to turn into something more significant. Sometimes, she reflected, the biggest changes started with the smallest incidents, and she was ready to be that catalyst for change. The morning of the traffic court hearing arrived with a weight of anticipation. Ms. Thompson stood before her mirror, adjusting her suit jacket, not her usual federal court attire, but professional enough to command respect. She'd been in countless courtrooms, but today felt different. Today, she would be on the other side of the bench. The local courthouse had a different atmosphere from her usual federal building. The hallways buzzed with nervous energy as people clutched their citations and waited for their cases to be called. Some looked resigned, others worried, most just wanting to get it over with and get back to their lives. She observed the proceedings while waiting for her case. Person after person approached the bench, most accepting whatever fine the judge handed down without question. The judge, a man with graying hair and reading glasses perched on his nose, barely looked up from his papers as he processed each case with assembly line efficiency. "Your Honor," one young woman pleaded, "I just started a new job, and I can't afford this fine right now." The judge's response was a curt suggestion to set up a payment plan with the clerk. No discussion, no consideration of circumstances, just next case, next fine, next person. Ms. Thompson watched as an elderly gentleman struggled to explain that the stop sign had been hidden by overgrown bushes. The judge cut him off mid-sentence with a sharp rap of his gavel. "The law is the law," he declared, $500. The old man's shoulders slumped as he shuffled away from the bench. When her name was called, she approached with the confidence of someone who had spent decades in courtrooms. The judge didn't look up, his pen already poised to write down another fine. "Stop sign violation and failure to cooperate," he droned, flipping through her citation. $500. The amount was more than triple the standard fine for a stop sign violation. She had done her research. The typical fine was $150. This disparity was exactly what she had prepared for. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and professional, "I'd like to address the charges." The judge continued writing, making a dismissive gesture with his free hand. But she stood her ground, the weight of 20 years of legal experience behind her words. "I'm a federal prosecutor," she continued, placing her credentials on the bench. "I work in the federal courthouse downtown, and I believe there are several procedural irregularities with this citation that need to be addressed." For the first time that morning, the judge's pen stopped moving. He looked up, his reading glasses sliding down his nose as he studied her face, then her credentials. The courtroom, usually a conveyor belt of quick fines and hurried exits, suddenly grew very quiet. The air in the room shifted. Other defendants, waiting their turn, leaned forward in their seats. The court clerk paused her typing. Even the bailiff, who had been scrolling through his phone, looked up with interest. "A federal prosecutor?" The judge repeated, his tone noticeably different. He picked up her credentials, examining them with newfound attention. The same credentials the officer had dismissed 2 weeks ago now commanded the judge's full focus. She remained composed, though her heart raced. This wasn't just about her anymore. She thought about everyone else in the courtroom. The young woman worried about her new job, the elderly man with the hidden stop sign, all the others who had been processed through the system without a voice. "Yes, Your Honor," she replied, "and I'd like to present evidence regarding both the recent construction in the area that led to the stop sign violation and the questionable nature of the failure to cooperate charge." She pulled out her carefully prepared documentation, including photographs of the newly installed sign and statistics on traffic stop patterns in the area. The judge's demeanor had completely transformed. Gone was the dismissive attitude, replaced by an almost uncomfortable attentiveness. He glanced around the now silent courtroom, aware of the dozens of eyes watching this unexpected turn of events. The same system that had been rushing through cases moments ago suddenly found time for a thorough review. The same judge who had been issuing automatic fines now listened intently as she presented her case. The irony wasn't lost on anyone in the courtroom, especially not on those still waiting for their cases to be called. This moment, she realized, was bigger than a traffic citation. It was a spotlight on how justice could depend on who you were, what credentials you held, how much power you had to speak up. As she stood there, she made a silent promise to all those watching. This was just the beginning of a much larger conversation about equal justice under law. The courtroom's atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The judge's face flushed as he examined Ms. Thompson's credentials more carefully, his earlier dismissiveness replaced by an uncomfortable recognition. He cleared his throat, adjusting his reading glasses as if seeing the entire situation through a new lens. "I see you handle major federal cases," he said, his voice notably softer than before. The same credentials that had been ignored at the traffic stop now commanded his complete attention. His eyes darted between the badge and her face, perhaps noticing for the first time the confident bearing of an experienced prosecutor. The judge's law clerk hurriedly approached the bench, whispering something in his ear. Ms. Thompson could guess what was being said. She had prosecuted several high-profile cases in the federal courthouse just 2 blocks away. Cases that had made headlines, cases that had set precedents, cases this judge would certainly know about. She watched as realization dawned on the judge's face. Just last month, she had successfully prosecuted a complex white-collar crime case that had been the talk of the legal community. The defendant had been a prominent figure, and the case had required months of careful preparation and strategic presentation. "Your Honor," she continued, keeping her voice steady, "I'd like to address not just my case, but a pattern I've observed while waiting here this morning." She gestured to the crowded courtroom, where dozens of citizens sat watching the scene unfold. The disparity in fines and the handling of these cases raises some concerning questions about equal treatment under the law. The other defendants in the courtroom leaned forward, their own citations clutched in their hands. The young woman who couldn't afford her fine wiped away tears. The elderly man with the hidden stop sign nodded encouragingly. They had all witnessed the judge's transformation, and now they watched with a mixture of hope and curiosity. "I've brought documentation," Ms. Thompson continued, pulling out a folder. "These are records of standard fines for similar violations, along with statistics on fine amounts across different neighborhoods in our district." She placed the papers on the bench, each page telling its own story of systemic disparities. The bailiff, who had been slouching against the wall, straightened up. The court clerk stopped her rhythmic typing, hands hovering over the keyboard. Even the police officer who had written her ticket, standing at the back of the courtroom waiting to testify in other cases, shifted uncomfortably. "Furthermore," she added, "I've noted several procedural irregularities in how these cases are being processed." She pulled out another document, a printout of the local traffic court rules and procedures. "According to these guidelines, each defendant is entitled to present their case fully before any fine is assessed." The judge's face reddened further as he glanced at the long line of people still waiting to be heard. How many of them had he cut off mid-explanation? How many had he dismissed without a proper hearing? The weight of those hasty judgments seemed to settle on his shoulders. A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Someone in the back whispered, "That's why we need more people like her in the system." Another voice added, finally, someone speaking up. The whispers grew until the judge had to rat his gavel for order. "I would like to request," Ms. Thompson said into the renewed silence, "that not only my case, but all cases heard today be reviewed with proper consideration and due process." She stood firm, her presence at the bench no longer that of a traffic violator, but of a guardian of justice. The judge removed his glasses, rubbing the bridge of his nose. His next words would be crucial, not just for this case, but for his reputation and the integrity of his court. The power dynamic had shifted, and everyone in the room knew it. "Perhaps," he said slowly, "we should take a brief recess to review these materials." He glanced at the clock, then at the full courtroom. "And when we resume, we'll ensure that every case receives appropriate consideration." Ms. Thompson nodded but remained at the bench. "Your Honor, if I may suggest, this might be an opportunity to examine not just today's cases, but the entire process by which traffic violations are handled in this court." Her words were diplomatic, but their implication was clear. As the judge called for a 15-minute recess, the courtroom buzzed with excited whispers. People who had entered the court feeling powerless now sat up straighter, hope replacing resignation in their eyes. They had witnessed something rare and valuable, the moment when justice wasn't just a word in a law book, but a living, breathing force for change. When court resumed after the recess, the atmosphere was electric. Ms. Thompson stood at the bench, her posture straight but not rigid, her expression determined but not confrontational. Years of courtroom experience had taught her that the most powerful arguments came from a place of composed strength. "Your Honor," she began, her voice clear and steady, "I'd like to address several issues that go beyond my individual case." She pulled out a small notebook where she'd been recording her observations throughout the morning. "In the 2 hours I've spent in this courtroom today, I've witnessed concerning patterns that need to be discussed." The judge, who had returned from recess looking notably more subdued, nodded for her to continue. The earlier swagger had disappeared from his demeanor, replaced by an awkward attentiveness. "First," she said, turning slightly to include the whole courtroom in her address, I've observed that fines are being issued without proper consideration of circumstances or context. The traffic stop that brought me here involved a newly installed stop sign in a construction zone. Yet when I attempted to explain this, I was cut off, just as others before me were cut off." She paused, letting her words sink in. The other defendants in the courtroom nodded in recognition. The young woman who had pleaded about her new job wiped her eyes with a tissue offered by the person next to her. "Second," she continued, "the amount of these fines appears to be arbitrary and inconsistent. My research shows that the standard fine for a stop sign violation is $150. Yet many people today, myself included, have been charged $500, more than triple the standard amount." The court clerk had stopped typing, her fingers hovering over the keyboard as she listened. Even the bailiff had moved closer, drawn in by the measured intensity of Ms. Thompson's words. "Third, and most concerning," she said, her voice taking on a gentle but firm tone, "is the dismissive treatment of citizens who come before this court. Every person here deserves to be heard, regardless of their title, profession, or appearance. The fact that my treatment changed so dramatically when you learned of my profession as a federal prosecutor only highlights this issue." The judge shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Several people in the gallery nodded vigorously, and someone whispered, "Amen to that." "I've spent my career upholding the law," she continued, "and I've learned that justice isn't just about rules and regulations. It's about fairness, respect, and equal treatment. When I was stopped 2 weeks ago, the officer didn't see a federal prosecutor. He saw someone he felt he could intimidate. When I entered this courtroom today, I wasn't treated as a legal professional or even as a citizen deserving of basic respect until my credentials came to light." She opened her briefcase and pulled out several documents. "I have here statistical data showing patterns of discriminatory treatment in traffic courts across our district. I also have testimonies from other legal professionals who have witnessed similar issues. This isn't about one case or one courtroom. It's about a system that needs to change." The judge, who had been listening with increasing discomfort, finally spoke. "Ms. Thompson, what exactly are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting, Your Honor, that we use this moment as an opportunity for meaningful change. I propose a review of all traffic court procedures, transparent guidelines for fine amounts, and mandatory training for court personnel on equal treatment under the law." She turned to face the crowded courtroom. "Every person here today has a story. Every person here deserves to be heard. The law should be applied fairly and equally, not based on who someone appears to be or what credentials they carry." The officer who had issued her ticket stood at the back of the courtroom, his face a mixture of embarrassment and defensiveness. She met his gaze steadily, not with anger but with determination. "Your Honor, I move that my case be dismissed based on the procedural irregularities I've outlined. But more importantly, I request that this court take immediate steps to address these systemic issues. I'm willing to work with the court administration to develop and implement new guidelines." As she finished speaking, the courtroom remained silent for a long moment. Her words hung in the air, heavy with truth and the promise of change. The other defendants watched the judge, waiting to see how he would respond to this powerful confrontation of the system's failures. In that moment, everyone present knew they were witnessing something significant, not just the challenge to an unfair fine, but a challenge to the very way justice was administered in their community. The next few minutes would determine whether this would be just another day in traffic court or the beginning of real change. Word spread through the legal community like wildfire. By the next morning, Ms. Thompson's office phone was ringing nonstop. Fellow attorneys, court staff, and community members all wanted to share similar stories they'd kept quiet about for years. "I watched the whole thing," said a court interpreter, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've seen this happening for years, but never had the courage to speak up." She described countless instances of dismissive treatment and inflated fines, particularly for non-English speakers who struggled to defend themselves. The local bar association called an emergency meeting. In the wood-paneled conference room, lawyers from across the city gathered to discuss what had happened. Ms. Thompson sat quietly as others shared their experiences, public defenders describing clients pressured into guilty pleas, civil rights attorneys presenting data on fine disparities, and even prosecutors admitting they'd noticed the patterns, but hadn't known how to address them. A young public defender stood up, his voice full of passion. "Yesterday, I watched one of my clients get a $500 fine for a broken taillight. He's working 2 jobs just to feed his family. These fines aren't just numbers, they're crushing people's lives." Back at the federal courthouse, Ms. Thompson found unexpected allies. The cleaning staff stopped her in the hallway to share stories of their own encounters with traffic court. One woman had lost her car because she couldn't pay cumulative fines that had spiraled out of control. A maintenance worker described how his teenage son had given up on driving altogether after repeated stops and citations. The local news caught wind of the story. Reporters gathered outside the courthouse, eager to cover what was becoming a watershed moment for the community. Ms. Thompson declined interviews, knowing this wasn't about personal publicity, it was about systemic change. Her daughter called from law school, excited and proud. "Mom, my professors are using your case as an example in class. They're talking about how one person standing up can expose deeper problems in the system." The pride in her daughter's voice made Ms. Thompson's eyes well up with tears. The court clerk who had witnessed everything reached out privately. "You wouldn't believe the changes already happening," she whispered during a chance meeting in the courthouse cafeteria. "The judge has been different since that day. He's actually listening to people, taking time with each case. It's like he woke up." Community organizations began collecting data and testimonies. A local advocacy group compiled a report documenting hundreds of similar cases. They'd found patterns of inflated fines in certain neighborhoods, disproportionate failure to cooperate charges, and a troubling correlation between fine amounts and defendants' appearances. The officer who had issued the original ticket requested a meeting through proper channels. In a small conference room, he sat across from Miss Thompson, his demeanor markedly different from their first encounter. "I've been thinking a lot about that night," he admitted. "Maybe I made some assumptions I shouldn't have." The district attorney's office launched an internal review of traffic court procedures. They discovered that fine amounts varied wildly depending on which judge was presiding and which officer had written the ticket. There were no standardized guidelines, no oversight, no accountability. Other courts in neighboring districts started examining their own practices. Judges began asking questions about their own biases. Court administrators started reviewing their procedures. The ripple effects spread further than anyone had expected. Local law schools requested Ms. Thompson as a guest speaker. She shared her story with future lawyers, emphasizing the importance of standing up against injustice, no matter how small it might seem. "Every interaction in the legal system matters," she told them. "Every person deserves dignity and respect under the law." The young woman who couldn't afford her fine on that fateful day found her way to Ms. Thompson's office. "After what you did," she said, tears in her eyes, "they reviewed my case. The fine was reduced to a reasonable amount. But more than that, they listened to me. For the first time, they actually listened." In the federal courthouse break room, Ms. Thompson overheard 2 janitors discussing their recent traffic court experiences. "It's different now," one said to the other. "The judge looked me in the eye. He asked about my situation. I never thought I'd see the day." As she sat in her office that evening, surrounded by case files and thank you notes from strangers, Ms. Thompson reflected on how a simple traffic stop had turned into something so much bigger. It wasn't just about one fine, one judge, or one courtroom. It was about dignity, respect, and the fundamental promise of equal justice under law. 6 months after that fateful day in traffic court, the changes were visible to everyone. The old wooden benches in the courthouse now held people with something new in their eyes: hope. The fear and resignation that once filled the air had been replaced by a sense of dignity and fair treatment. The judge who had once rushed through cases now sat attentively, listening to each person's story. On this particular morning, he carefully considered an elderly woman's explanation about her expired registration. "I understand your situation," he said kindly, working out a reasonable payment plan that wouldn't burden her fixed income. Ms. Thompson watched from the back of the courtroom, a quiet smile on her face. She hadn't planned to become an agent of change, but sometimes life had other plans. The training programs she helped develop were now mandatory for all court personnel, teaching them about implicit bias and the importance of equal treatment. The court clerk's office had been transformed. New guidelines hung on the walls, clearly stating standard fine amounts and payment options. The clerk who had once witnessed so much unfairness now proudly explained these rights to every person who came through her window. "You should see the difference in people's faces," the clerk told Ms. Thompson during a chance meeting. "They're not afraid anymore. They know they'll be heard, even if they don't have fancy credentials or expensive lawyers." In the police department, changes were happening too. The officer who had given Miss Thompson the ticket became an unexpected ally, speaking to his fellow officers about the importance of fair treatment. "We're here to serve everyone," he'd say during roll call, "not to judge them based on how they look or what car they drive." Community organizations had set up a help desk in the courthouse lobby, staffed by volunteers who helped people understand their rights and options. On this day, a young mother with 2 children received guidance about her traffic ticket, learning about payment plans and community service options she never knew existed. The local bar association created a special committee focused on court equality, with Ms. Thompson serving as an advisor. They monitored fine patterns, reviewed complaints, and ensured that the reforms stayed on track. More importantly, they made sure that every voice had a chance to be heard. During lunch breaks, Ms. Thompson would sometimes sit in the courthouse cafeteria, listening to conversations around her. "I got a ticket last week," she overheard someone say, "but you know what? The judge actually listened to my explanation, treated me like a human being." Her daughter, now a practicing attorney herself, carried these lessons into her own career. "Mom," she said during one of their weekly calls, "I had a client tell me today that the courts are different now. That they feel respected even when they're in trouble. That's because of you." But the most significant changes were in the small, everyday moments. Like when a teenager with a speeding ticket felt confident enough to explain his situation to the judge, or when a single mother successfully negotiated a manageable payment plan for her fines, or when an immigrant with limited English skills received proper translation services and a fair hearing. The training sessions for court staff became a model for other districts. Ms. Thompson would sometimes visit these sessions, sharing her story not as a federal prosecutor, but as someone who had experienced unfairness firsthand. "Every person who walks through those courthouse doors," she would say, "deserves to be treated with respect and dignity." The judge who had once tried to fine her $500 became one of the strongest advocates for change. "We got comfortable with a system that wasn't serving everyone equally," he'd admitted during a judicial conference. "Sometimes it takes someone brave enough to stand up and show us our own biases." Local law schools added new courses on bias in the justice system, using what became known as the traffic court case as a teaching tool. Students learned that real change often started with small moments of courage and determination. One year after that memorable day, Ms. Thompson stood in front of a packed auditorium at a legal reform conference. "Change doesn't always come from big moments or dramatic gestures," she told the audience. "Sometimes it comes from standing your ground in a small traffic court, speaking up not just for yourself, but for everyone who deserves to be treated fairly." As she walked back to her office that evening, she passed the traffic court. Through the windows, she could see people being treated with respect, being listened to, being given a fair chance. The system wasn't perfect yet, but it was better. And sometimes, she thought, that's how progress works, one small change at a time, one courtroom at a time, one person at a time. The story had come full circle. What began as a simple traffic stop had sparked a movement for change that continued to grow. In courtrooms across the city, people now walked in with their heads held high, knowing they would be treated fairly, not because of who they were or what credentials they held, but simply because it was their right as human beings seeking justice.